everyone. This is so neat being part of Open Data Week and the 10th year anniversary, and Vital City is really excited to be part of it for the first time. It's also really cool to see all the open data. As you'll see, I'm very much in the crime data, but just like how much is out there, it's really exciting. So I'm going to be talking to you basically about what Vital City has been doing in the last about year or so, and also what we plan on doing in the future. The title of this is just Exploring 30 Years of NYC Crime and What Comes Next. My name is Paul Reaping. I'm the Director of Research at Vital City at NYC. And if you might not know exactly what Vital City is, so Vital City has been called a lot of things, including I think the New York Times has called us a think tank. Other places have just called us a journal. Ultimately, I think we're like an online journal. Sometimes we publish things in print, but we also do a lot of policy work. So our official description is that Vital City seeks to improve civic life by finding great ideas and innovative research and making them available and understandable to those who shape urban policy. We also make relevant data accessible to anyone who wants to get a better understanding of how cities work, because we believe an informed citizenry is a crucial pillar of a healthy democracy, which I think is a pretty great mission. So with that said, for the agenda today, I'm just going to be giving some highlights of our end of year crime report. We do, in my opinion, probably the most in-depth exploration of crime in New York City, really looking at all the nuances and everything that has gone on beyond just the big headlines. So I'll talk about that. Then I'm going to introduce our new Crime Data Explorer, which uses open data. And this is something that everybody can use. It's a tool we hope that all of you will be using in the future. And then I'm going to introduce some ideas for future projects that Vital City has, what we plan to do with them. And then I'm going to be asking for your feedback on not only those future projects, but also other ones that you might have that you think Vital City might be a good place to get them up and running. So before I start, I just want to say that Vital City uses a lot of open data sources. So today, these are all of the different sources that will be included, at least in some way. So you can see here, it ranges from CompStat to all of the crime disorder, to the hate crimes dashboard, to the domestic violence reports, to the stop, question, and frisk data, the civilian complaint review board data, the annual report, subway data related to ridership, NYPD calls for service, both 911 and 311. And then we also use some national sources of open data, such as the Real-Time Crime Index from Asher. So you will see all of these data sources cited as this presentation goes on, but I just wanted to highlight that we really highlight open data. This is our kind of like bread and butter is what we do. And we try and make the open data that's out there accessible for others and available in ways that people can understand, and we can improve the lives of New Yorkers and beyond. Okay, so I'm first going to start talking about our end of year crime report. So the first thing that I want to say is that the story of crime at NYC is really nuanced, and I think it's way more nuanced than some of the headlines like to say. I first want to start out, though, by saying that New York City is the second safest city in terms of murders. So if we look at peer cities with populations over 1 million people, New York City actually ranks second in murders. So if you're wondering who number one is, that is San Diego, but New York City is number one. And a lot of times I've heard in sessions that we've had that New York City is almost the gold standard for reducing crime for other cities. I won't say which cities in respect to them, but like we do pretty well in crime as much as it comes up, I feel like, in press. New York City is a pretty safe overall. One thing that you might have heard, though, in the last set of headlines is that murders and shootings were at near all-time lows. Shootings were actually at all-time lows. Murder was at near all-time lows. I believe only 2017 and 2018 had a lower number of murders than it did in 2025. And that's really, obviously, incredible news and something that should be celebrated for New York City. However, what I want to point out is that the story of crime in NYC is nuanced, and that there are other types of crimes that we're not doing so great in. So if you look at all major crimes, so that includes murder, rape, felony, assault, robbery, burglary, grand larceny, which is stealing over $1,000 of goods, or grand larceny of a motor vehicle, you'll see that across all of them, comparatively to pre-pandemic in 2019, we're actually up by 27%. So that is obviously driving some of the feelings of like uneasiness of New Yorkers as you walk down the street. Yes, you might be much less likely to be end up murdered or shot, but there's these other major crimes that are still much higher. And then some of the major ones that we're going to be looking at are felony assault, because felony assaults are assaults that are either with a weapon, which includes a gun, but it can also include things that people end up in the hospital for because they're pretty severe assaults. I'd also like to point out that the change from 2024 to 2025, we are, for the most part, getting better. You'll see that there was a 2% reduction in all major crimes between 2024 to 2025, that huge reduction in murder from 2024 to 2025. And you will see that there is this increase in rape from 2024 to 2025. But if you follow sort of politics, you'll see that the definition of rape changed in the state of New York in 2024. So it's hard to say whether or not that is a true increase or not. We would expect an increase based off of the new definition. But like I said, felony assaults, though, they have continued to increase, and we will discuss that briefly. So, like I said, New York City is a very safe city in terms of murders, just to put that out there point blank. However, the city's reductions in murders from pre-pandemic to 2025 lags behind the nation in large cities except San Antonio. So there have been a lot of people that are saying, wow, like New York City is like incredible. We have had this huge reduction in murders. It's not, it's actually below the rate for the entire country. So it's not something that New York necessarily can say that they are doing better than anybody else. In fact, if you look at all jurisdictions, this is using the Real Crime Index by Asher, you'll see that we're at a 3.1% reduction from pre-pandemic, while all jurisdictions is a 16.1%. And you can say, okay, we were at really low numbers prior to that. Like we have fewer murders than some other places. But then like our peer San Diego, which had even fewer than we did, they're like down 32%. So it's hard to say that is the reason, but it does show that this reduction in murders is really a nationwide experience for the entire country and not something that is necessarily unique to New York. So just that bit of nuance. I'd like to then also say the issue that we're having with felony assaults. So felony assaults increased for the 6th year in a row. This is obviously not good news. They are major crimes. And we'll see that total assaults have also been increasing, especially since the pandemic. However, they did fall about 1.8% in 2025 compared to 2024. But overall, these are types of assaults on New Yorkers that are quite severe, and they are continuing to increase. We don't really know the reason behind this. So that's normally the next question that I'll get. Why are felony assaults increasing so much in New York City? We're currently doing a research project right now, trying to literally look at every data point possible related to felony assaults that we can get our hands on. And we should have some insights within the next month or so. So if you follow us, you might have some information about that in the future. But for right now, we can't really say what is causing this huge increase in felony assaults. The other thing I will say is, although felony assaults have started to increase significantly since the pandemic, they were actually rising since 2008. So this is not a new phenomenon. It's something that has continued since 2008 and has accelerated since the pandemic. So it's not something that's necessarily definitely related to just the pandemic. It's something that was made worse by the pandemic. So this is just another way to say this. So felony assaults made up 9.8% of all felonies in 2006, but it increased to nearly 16% of all felonies by 2025. They've also gone from the 10th most common offense, and this is across all crimes, literally even small crimes, very small crimes. They've gone from the 10th most common offense to the 6th most, and that's quite concerning because now we are at nearly 30,000 felony assaults per year. When in 2008, when they were the lowest, we were at about 17,000 felony assaults. So that's a huge difference. Another thing that people might not get through the big headlines about New York City is that total offenses are also at their highest level in 2 decades. So if you look at all offenses in the data and the open data, you'll see that the total count of offenses that are occurring in the complaints file is their highest level. And we don't really know if it's more than 2 decades because really we don't have the data going back past 2006. But we do know that they've continued to increase, especially since the pandemic. This includes all different types of things. So like things like harassment and petite larceny, misdemeanor assault, those are like the big top three in terms of quantity, in terms of crimes, but also vehicle and traffic laws, dangerous drugs. So your next question might be like, okay, that might be true, but maybe the police are really like amping it up and really doing a good job at catching the people who are committing crimes, and maybe this is not a true signal. So one thing that we did is we looked at victim or witness reported offenses compared to those that are sensitive to police enforcement. Some crimes are just unlikely to increase based off of police enforcement. So what I mean by that is that like murder is unlikely to increase because there's more police and they're patrolling more. That's unlikely. The same goes for felony assault, for misdemeanor assault, for things getting stolen. So grand larceny, also robberies, which are like violent crimes. Those are unlikely to increase because police enforcement is more sensitive. Some crimes are more likely to be increased because of police enforcement. You can think of like dangerous drugs, for example. Those are much more likely based off of how patrolling is going. Dangerous weapons, where people are getting checked for weapons when they may enter the subway. One huge one is fare enforcement. So that is going to spike through the roof when enforcement is going on and fall off when there's no enforcement going on. So, but the takeaway here, though, is that it doesn't matter. So whether or not it's police enforcement or victim reported and not police enforcement sensitive, the increase in crimes is real since the pandemic, which really goes back to this kind of sentiment and feeling that New Yorkers have as they walk down the streets, which feels just like you're a little more uneasy, at least that's what the surveys say, when people did in 2019. The next thing I'll talk about briefly is the subway. And I would like to say that the subway is extraordinarily safe, especially compared to other subway systems across the United States. This is on a per ridership basis. We have so many people riding the subway, like we're talking like counts in the 1 to 2 billion, depending on what year you're at. So there's about one major violent crime for every million rides on the subway. And there's about one major property crime, which are almost all grand larcenies, one major property crime for every million rides. So it's a very rare event for there to be one of these major crimes. It's not saying that some of the other minor crimes aren't as prevalent, but I'm just putting it out there that the major crimes are extremely rare. Vital City has actually run an article before that has estimated that you're probably more likely to be a victim of a crime walking on the streets of New York City and then in the subway. So just to give some basis for how we look at crime in the subway.
Sorry, Paul, before you get too far ahead, we have two questions. One from Noel about reversion to the mean. What went down was going to come back up. And then if you didn't see, there's another asking you for further clarification on the unlikely to increase due to more police enforcement point.
Yeah. Okay, so I think the reversion to the mean, I think we did see a reversion to the mean in relationship to murders and shootings. We had the huge increase during the pandemic, and now we're having a back to settling to where we were prior to that spike. However, we are below the pandemic, and the entire country is seeing levels that are below the pandemic for the most part, almost every city. So that is a good sign, but also shows that it's more of a national trend that's maybe more sociological or more on some larger level that it's hard to put your finger on. And then the other question was about unlikely increase due to more police enforcement. There is some things that the police, it doesn't matter how many police there are. If somebody is a victim or sees a specific crime like a murder, an assault, these things are almost always reported by the individual. So therefore they're reported to the police. There are a lot of crimes where the police are the ones, for the most part, doing the reporting. So something like a subway, somebody like jumping the turnstile at a subway, like the police are the ones reporting that data. So therefore, as they're doing more enforcement of that specific crime, we would expect those crime numbers to go up. And I don't have it here, but if you actually look at fare enforcement, they've like majorly spiked within the last 2 years. So we would not include that when we are looking at crimes that are sensitive, looking for crimes that are not sensitive to police enforcement. Looking to see if there's anything else. Okay, and we also have, if you read our end of year crime report, which I will show how to find it, we have an explanation with all of the crimes that are included in the police enforcement sensitive and those that are not. Okay. So one of the major headlines that you might have seen in the news, especially by Hochul and others, is that subway crime had reached the lowest level it had been in like a generation. There are some iterations of this depending on what article you might have read. And there's a lot of nuance to that. I think that is something to celebrate, but the issue is that they did not account for subway ridership. So there was a 14.3% decline in major crime counts since 2019, but the risk of victimization on a given subway trip in 2025 is 13.4% higher. That's because we're still at considerably lower ridership on the subway than we were pre-pandemic. So when we talk about counts on the subway of these major crimes, it's just really important to pay attention to that, because naturally, as we expect the population of the subway to decrease, the crimes are also going to decrease. What I think is a little funny about this is that they will say the lowest crime counts except for the pandemic when the ridership fell a ton. So it's like they know that ridership is important to determining how many crime counts they are, but it just feels really good to say that we're at the lowest level. However, the truth is that we're still at a higher rate. So again, when that goes to the way that people feel on the subway, they might feel a little uneasy or unsure. And that's because it's real. Like the reality is that you might face or see a crime. You're more likely to now than you were pre-pandemic. And then the last thing I'll say, and I won't go into too much detail of this, we also look at jail data and we look at some court data. So we really track the rate of death per 1,000 ADP. So that's the daily population in jail. We track pretty much real time on our website. Whenever it happens, we update this tracker, maybe like a week behind or 5 days behind, but we try our best to do it as quickly as possible. But if you'll see in 2025, there are 15 people who died while they were in jail in NYC. And that's concerning because in 2015, when there was the Nunes monitor was put in place because of unsafe environments within Rikers and our jail system, there were 11 individuals who died. And we have more data on this, but it's just something, in a lot of cases, the violence has actually increased since the original Nunes monitor was put in place. Okay. So the next thing that I want to turn to, but is also very related to what we're speaking of, is our Crime Data Explorer. And I first want to thank the Dataface. So this is the firm that we work with to help make our Crime Data Explorer I'm about to show you. They're fantastic people. I highly recommend them. So I just wanted to give them a big thank you, because without them, this would not have been possible. And I just want to say, like, how is the Explorer that we made different than CompStat? It's actually pretty different than CompStat. We have the ability to compare 30 plus years of NYC crime data. So that's complaints and arrests and shootings. Data is in both rate and count form, allowing for comparisons. We include demographic data, poverty, and racial composition in the Explorer. We have the ability to compare precincts and boroughs across time. And because we have a per capita rate, you're able to actually see how what precinct compares to another one. We have a neighborhood search feature. We also included the 3 most high volume misdemeanors in this Explorer. And in my opinion, it's pretty easy to use. We also have a broad definition of all crime. It's basically it doesn't actually include all crime. It's all crime with an asterisk. So it includes all the major crimes, as you can see here. And then it also includes the non-major highest volume misdemeanors. So that's petite larceny, misdemeanor assault, and harassment. I'm putting that out because these offenses together account for roughly 2/3 of all recorded crime in New York City. So it's a pretty good proxy for tracking how all crime is doing beyond just major crime, because the 3 non-major crime categories actually account for more than the rest of the major crime categories. And if you look at the crimes that are not sensitive to police enforcement, it accounts for 90% of those crimes. So it's a pretty good proxy for what's going on in New York City. Okay, so I'm going to just switch my screen. I'm going to do a live demonstration of the Crime Explorer. Okay, You should now see the Vital City website. So if you've never been here, this is what we look like. So we invite you to come to vitalcitynyc.org. You will also see up here, we have data. We have our Crime Data Explorer, our charts and data stories and experiments. So actually, before I jump into the Data Explorer, let me show you where you can find our data and our different crime reports and other reports that we've done in the past. You can go to charts and data stories. It'll bring you to this page where we highlight some of the major charts and data and tables. Some I presented here, some that I haven't. We have it split into crime and then our last major data stories related to crime, jails again, and then our major incarceration stories, and then finally specifically subway, and then our major subway stories. So if you are ever lost or need to find our data, you can just go to the website and you will find our data here. We just launched on this new page called Experiments. This is not necessarily data work that we have done. So as it says here, it's just the tools featured in this gallery were built by institutions, small teams, and individuals, not by Vital City. But they're really cool tools that we've collected over time for mostly New York City, but they're very interesting. And I highly suggest that you come by to look at our website and look at this page, just because we've really put together so much open data resources in ways that we feel would be accessible for the public. And we are welcome. If you have something that you would like to highlight here, please email me. I'll have my email at the end, or info@vitalcitynyc.org. Okay, so now to get to the Crime Data Explorer, you can just go to data and then you can go to Crime Data Explorer just as I did there. So here is the page. And first off, we have the 2025 to 2024 comparison. So you can quickly see across all of these categories of crime how they've changed since all the way back to 1993 when we have data. You can also see for 2024 to 2025, or whatever year you're comparing to, you can see the actual count. And then if you would like to change the year to look at a different year to do a comparison, you can do that as well. So if we look at 2019, which is pre-pandemic, you can then see how all of these different crimes changed over time since 2019. So we do this so you can quickly find the counts of whatever crime that you need. You can see overall since 1993 till today, what the total trajectory was, because I often think that's overlooked, how crime has changed drastically since the 90s in New York City. But we hope that this will be helpful for you. One thing that I want to pay attention to, and as I explain this Data Explorer, I'm actually going to be doing a bit of a story of the felony assault, because like we said, we think that's really important and an issue that's going on today. And if you can see here, felony assaults are up 44% since pre-pandemic. If we look at 2008, when felony assaults were the lowest, it's up 86% since the pandemic. And then if we look, I believe it's even in 1998, which is arguably a time when crime was not great in New York City, you can see that felony assaults are up 3% since then, when all of the other major crimes you can see are quite down from that point. So there's something unique about felony assaults going on in New York City. So next, we have this map feature. As you can see here, you can toggle between arrests and complaints, and then also by the crime category. So we have the all major crimes, and then violent, property, and then our all crime proxy that I explained earlier. And then you can also look at the individual categories of crime, and it will reflect on the map. So for example, this is felony assault. And we also have a layer of poverty. So you can look at the poverty rate across the city and racial composition. I will say we allow you to download the data. So you're able to at any point download this data with this button and get it. So it's a real time. So it's going to download whatever view that you happen to be on. So just to give you a heads up. And then what else? Also, if you want to show somebody something that you did on this Explorer, you can specifically go and take the URL that you created up here and give them that specific URL, and it'll produce the same visualization that you just made. So if you wanted to share something that you found, you can do it in that way. Okay, So we also have a ability to look at counts if you prefer that compared to per capita rates across the precincts. And then you're also able to look how certain precincts or places changed since a certain year. So if we look back to 2019, this is felony assault. You can look to see where felony assaults have increased compared to where they've decreased. So if I were to hover over on one of these places, right now I'm in the 10th precinct, you'll see that there's been a 44% increase in the rate of felony assaults in the 10th precinct since 2019. That's above the whole Manhattan change of 34.4%. And so we're really trying to give you as much information and ability to do more with smaller units, and compared to the entire city or the entire borough, we really want you to be able to look at the neighborhood level. We also then have the ability to highlight, for example, the 10 most, let me reset this, the 10 most impoverished precincts, specifically because there's places that have had disinvestment and structural racism over the years, obviously have had higher rates of crime due to that disinvestment. So, for example, if you were to look at shooting incidents and then you highlight the 10 most impoverished precincts, you can see that they're pretty lined up. So just to highlight that. The same goes for felony assaults, which we are continuing with here. Finally, we also have a search feature, so where you're able to go and search for whatever neighborhood that you live in. So you can search by the name of your neighborhood, or you can search by the precinct of the neighborhood. So again, we're trying to do as much as possible to make this as accessible and unique to the individual that comes and wants to see how their neighborhood ranks specifically. Then as you go down, you'll see that we have a line chart to look more in depth over time. If we look at per capita, you can see how the different boroughs compare. So this is all major crimes. If we change to felony assault, you can see specifically that there's been a huge increase in the Bronx with felony assaults since the pandemic. Although there's been an increase everywhere, the Bronx has really been a much larger increase. We also have an ability to look at precincts. So here you're able to look at precincts over time. Per capita, one thing, if you know anything about per capita rates, you'll see that this is Midtown South. There's not a lot of people that necessarily live in Midtown South, but there's a ton of people in Midtown South. So the rate is always going to look really large there. That's just a caveat, but that doesn't mean that it's just because the population is low. So if we look at count, we see the precincts where felony assault are the highest, for example. And then you can also then go and look at specific boroughs to see within a borough, or a specific precinct, any precinct that you would like, and how it compares to the rest of the city or the borough that you're in. And finally, we have a distribution of all NYC crimes. So right now, this is all major crimes. You can also look at them proportionally. Here you can see that felony assaults went from 9.6 of all major crimes in 1993 to 24.5% of all major crimes in 2025. So something definitely that has increased comparatively. So you have total, you can also then add all crime. All crime only goes back to 2006, but these are the high level volume misdemeanors. And across all of these, you can also look by decade or pre-pandemic or the last 5 years, depending what you're looking at. So that's our Crime Data Explorer. We really encourage you to look at it. I see some of the questions. Can we export data from here too? Yes, you can use the download tool. I think probably within the next, I think there's been some questions about being able to download the entire data set as a whole as it is. I think we're going to add a link to the bottom just in case you've changed the filters or whatever, just so you'll always have that available. We do not have an ability to filter hate crime. I don't think that we figured out how to connect hate crime to these data. And can you filter juvenile versus adult? We cannot at this point, but these are all great questions for what I'm going to be speaking and then wanting your feedback too, as these are the exact questions that we want and what people would need, because we're hoping to expand on this project with more data. So These are great questions, specifically for juvenile versus adult. I think that's really possible with the data. One thing that we had for this specific data project was that it goes back to 1993. And so we only really have counts for some of these things back to 1993. But of course, we do have the full data available from 2006. So whatever we do in the future will probably be focused not a 30-year of crime data, but instead a now 20-year approximate bit of crime data where we look further. Okay, so now I'm going to briefly explain some future projects, which we're getting into already, and then going to elicit your feedback. Okay, so upcoming data projects, we are looking to do a expansion to our crime data explorer, exactly as I mentioned. Right now it's yearly level, but we're hoping to update to a section that tracks quarterly data. Also, the ability to select and see the trajectory of any crime category, not just your crimes, but any crime category over time. And finally, year-to-date comparisons on the quarterly level going back to 2006. I think that this is way to also, we could add juvenile versus adult crime. I think that's totally possible. I think it could be done with a toggle. The other thing that we want to do to expand out this Crime Data Explorer is to include basically an ability to toggle between street crime and transit crime. And we could also maybe do that for housing too. So be able to look back to 2006 and look forward to see how transit crime has really changed over time. So that's something that we're hoping to expand on, but we might need the money for. So if anybody wants to fund us for these projects, we would love it. Specifically for the transit crime tracker, I think it would be interesting to also look at fare evasion specifically and track the ridership over time. The monthly ridership would be really important. But one of our huge projects that we want to look at is a 311 disorder tracker. We've done a lot of work in the past with 311 data. As you can see here, you can see the distribution of 311 calls among city agencies, specifically how blue is the NYPD and how the NYPD is now responsible for considerably, probably the majority now of 311 calls, which was not the case back in 2010. We also have grouped 311 calls over time into these larger major categories. It's actually very hard. The 311 data is hard because the descriptions of certain categories change over time. And so as they change, it makes it hard to say whether or not something increases or not. And on top of that, 311 calls are always increasing just as people use 311 more. So that doesn't necessarily mean that more disorder is occurring, but rather more people are using the tool. So it's something that we need to consider. But for our 311 data, for our 311 disorder tracker, we would really want a unified source for tracking real time. So this would be something that would update like every day or every other day of 311 complaints and disorder, with clean categories, digestible categories, and an overall disorder tracker, taking into account the few things that I said earlier. The ability to see which agency it was assigned to, track if the complaint was marked as resolved, and then map complaints across the city, including tracked line charts over time. We really think that this would be useful and empowering to citizens to know if their 311 complaints are actually leading to action. We do know that just because the complaint was marked as resolved does not mean that it's actually resolved. We're very well aware of that, but it's still at least a step forward. It would be also useful to police, politicians, city government, and journalists to understand where disorder is occurring in the city and where it's not being resolved. There are some 311, like we have on our website a 311 sort of wrap dashboard, but that is not real time. It's not like every day updating and giving things where a citizen can go and say, I called 311, let me go see if it ended up in the data and it's actually there. And we think that would be really powerful for people. So at this point, I'm at the questions, suggestions, and feedback portion. Just general questions about Vital City, questions related to the end of year crime report, feedback for our Crime Explorer, which I've seen some already, suggestions for data projects the Vital City can bring to light, and input on the data projects already presented. And I also have my email there. So thank you for listening to me talk for so long.
And thanks for going through all of that. This is a really fantastic tool.
Yes, I hope people use it. We really did it, hopefully, for people, for it to be helpful and for people to be a little bit more engaged with how crime has changed over time, especially compared to the 1990s. There's a lot of nostalgia right now for the 1990s, which I get overall, but I don't know if we're nostalgic for 1990s crime in New York City as much as people. I don't think we want that. I see one question here. It could be helpful to think carefully about what ages to include in juvenile crime, since NYC has fluctuated on treating young kids, adults for incarceration and charging, and don't want to demonize 12 to 16-year-olds again. It's a great point. We have reported actually on Raise the Age in the past and how it's had an effect. It was actually not in this end of year crime report. I believe it was either the mid-year prior, the one before that, but we found that the number of kids who are being arrested or complaints related are lower than prior to Raise the Age overall for major crimes. Which is not always represented because often they focus, for example, on like gun crimes or something, but overall the major rate major crime rate among these individuals has decreased since Raise the Age. I also see curious if any court data are included in Explorer or planning to add any. Be interested how long it takes the average different crimes to make their way through the court system, thinking about speedy adjudication as a deterrent. Probably not specifically for this, but definitely a different project to do that with. You'll see in our end of year crime report, which again, you can find on our website by going just to data and then our data stories. We do talk specifically about speedy adjudication and about like how the system works. We don't really give the amount of days it takes. However, we do report on length of stay in the jails, which is a proxy for that. So that is all things that you can find in our end of year crime report. Next question, are you doing any kind of collaboration or analysis of crime data tracking with restorative justice? It's hard to track any data. It's much easier to track punitive approaches, which can drown out the benefits of more restorative and sustainable strategies. We have been in discussion with individuals, so we always have that in mind, and we try and be as fair as possible in our reporting. It's hard because there's kind of what we need to do better overall in the city, if this is my call, is for better data reporting of these specific practices and how they relate to people going through the justice system. I think right now there's not a lot of data on it. So then when people go and look at the data, they can have false assumptions because they don't really understand the nitty-gritty of what's going on and how people are moving through the justice system. And I think that it's really important. So I think we could use more clear and open data for that, and maybe Vital City could be the one to drive that. Are there any new areas you'll be analyzing related to cash bail reforms? This is not something I think we have on our docket for Vital City. However, we have our new series, kind of new, it's been around now. It's called like Reality Checks, where we take something that has been really important in the world that's been sometimes the nuance is lost to, and then we do a sort of reality check that goes through a deep dive, and I think that cash bail could definitely be one of them. And then has your team thought about adding more geographic boundaries in the future, community district, school district, etc.? Yeah, I think that we could. I guess there's no reason that we can't. I think it just adds a lot. Run a budget. And a lot of this takes a lot of data programming in the background and by development. So if anybody wants to fund Vital City and some of our data projects, we would love to add as many of these things as possible. We are a small organization. I don't think people realize how small Vital City is. For what I'm proud of to say that I think we produce a lot for the city, but we are very small. So we have so many ideas of things that we want to do, and this is all very helpful. And so if anybody wants to collaborate or help in any way, we would love that. I'm reading about the incarceration deaths that were reported by law, but there seems to be missing information actually leading up to the death. When we look at the deaths within the jail system, we track them. So we find out normally through the way everybody finds out, like it's reported, but then we go specifically to the actual articles about it. So there's not that many. So we read as many articles that we can about what people reporting it, what happened. We also use their names. So we get as much information from the backend system just by searching for their name in terms of like how long they had been in jail and how long they've been in jail, and also some of their other information about like their age. So we try and get as much as possible through that. And that's all I can really say for granular data. For ICE specifically, we did, if you look at our end of year report, we have one chart on ICE arrests in New York City. I didn't present it here, but if you see it, you'll find that although there's been a spike in the increase in arrests in New York City, if you go back a little bit further in time, it's historically not that much higher yet compared to what it was maybe in, I forget the exact year, but just a little bit further back. So there is a concern that ICE hasn't necessarily done a push here as much as they have done elsewhere. There's definitely been an increase, like a 80% increase since a year before, but we were at a historically low point in the city. So we have been trying to do as much data work on immigration or deportation and ICE as much as possible, but we're very limited by the data just as much as I feel like many of you are. I think specifically the Data Deportation Project, if you're familiar, they have probably the most data compared to, I guess, whatever the government reports itself. So we use that, but we're definitely limited. And so, but we're trying our best to figure things out. I know the city, so not Vital City, but the city as in the journal is doing a lot of work on this. And I think they'll probably be publishing something soon, or and they have already a lot of good work related to ICE and deportation so far in New York City. If there's any more questions, I'll take them. We can also, of course, thanks for thanks for the response. So if there's any more questions here, perhaps reversion to me, what went down was going to come back, perhaps comparing to modal levels over 30 and then relative to the lowest. Oh yes, we 100% agree that not comparing to like the lowest level ever is necessarily what we want, but at the same time, I think there's a push in government and policy that like they want it to be the lowest level ever, especially when it comes to murders and shootings. I think there's a drive that they want really for it to be so. But when it comes to headlines, I agree that's not really helpful. It's really why that we've included the entire 30 years of data. I would say the large takeaway point of the 30 years of data crime data explorer is to see that we're a relatively good place and have been in New York, even with the bump during the pandemic, where we are, like I said, the gold standard for many other cities. But I think New Yorkers just always want to be the best. So we're going to continue to try and get there. Thank you all for coming. Again, here's my email. Please reach out. We're always open to collaborations. If you have ideas for articles, if you want to pitch them, we also do that. And I really appreciate you all coming today. And I hope that we're helpful for you in the future.